Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Mnuchin with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. Globally, the number of coronavirus infections has exceeded 20 million, with nearly 735,000 deaths. The United States is leading with the most confirmed infections at 5 million, followed by Brazil with over 3 million cases. India is at third with more than 2.2 million cases after reporting over 53,000 new infections and 871 deaths in the past 24 hours. In Pakistan, 15 more people lost their lives to the virus, raising the death toll to 6,112 with over 284,000 infections. Lebanese President Michel Aoun has accepted the government's resignation over last weekend's massive explosion in Beirut, but Aoun has asked the government to stay as caretaker until a new cabinet is formed. Yesterday, Prime Minister Hassan Diab resigned, saying the explosion was a result of endemic corruption. China says the Afghan lawyer Jirga's decision to release Taliban prisoners will create favorable conditions for the intra-Afghan dialogue in the country. At a news briefing in Beijing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian has welcomed the step and said it was important to establish mutual trust. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation says Israel's plans to annex Palestinian land is a flagrant violation of international law and human rights. In a statement, the bloc's human rights body said it called on the global community to hold Israel accountable for rights violations. And in football, Manchester United beat FC Copenhagen by 1-0 at the Rhine Energy Stadium in Cologne to reach the Europa League semi-finals. Elsewhere, Inter Milan also booked a spot in the last four after defeating Bayern Leverkusen by 2-1 at the Merkur Spiel Arena in Düsseldorf. News in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now for the news in detail. Globally, the number of coronavirus infections has exceeded 20 million, with nearly 736,000 deaths. The United States is leading with the most confirmed infections at 5 million, followed by Brazil with over 3 million cases. India is at third with more than 2.2 million cases after reporting over 53,000 infections and 871 deaths in the past 24 hours. More in this report.
Governments are battling economic recession and overwhelmed healthcare systems, but COVID-19 continues to dominate. The virus continues to batter the Americas. The U.S. President Donald Trump has not been able to garner support of the Democrats on his executive orders for a second economic relief package.
It's a responsibility for the states to pick up 25% of the costs. As you can see from this slide, that cost would inure to the state of California, its taxpayers, roughly $700 million per week. If that fund, and it's a fund that has limited resources, $70 billion currently, if that fund drops to $25 billion or less, then those federal dollars disappear.
In Europe, Germany continues to report new infections, but so far the country's healthcare system has not been overwhelmed. Globally, states are easing restrictions, and the World Health Organization has urged caution and called for localized lockdowns.
Countries in Western Europe in general have suppressed the majority of virus transmission and are now seeing flare-ups of that disease. The trick for them now is to really focus on identifying those clusters of disease, identifying any new community transmission, and putting in place the kind of localised measures that can contain the virus, suppress the virus, and reduce exposure, and try to avoid, if possible, having the sort of countrywide lockdowns that had did so much economic damage before.
In Australia, cases in the state of Victoria are finally declining, but in the New South Wales, the outbreak is picking up pace. In Asia, locally transmitted cases continue to emerge as regional countries battle to hit the zero mark.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the COVID-19 mortality rate has fallen as 15 people lost their lives to the virus in the past 24 hours, raising the toll to 6,112. The Health Ministry says 531 cases were reported overnight as the tally crossed 285,000. The ministry said over 261,000 people have recovered from the virus so far. It said there are over 17,000 active cases in the country, among which 780 are in a critical condition. Sindh remains the worst hit province with over 124,000 infections, while Punjab has reported more than 94,000 cases. Now, the 3 youth martyred by Indian troops in a fake encounter in occupied Kashmir in July have been identified as labourers of the Rajouri district. The victims' families say they identified their loved ones after their pictures were circulated on social media. 2 of the victims were working locally as masons. The Indian troops during the operation claimed they were militant. The occupied forces have martyred dozens of innocent Kashmiris in fake encounters in the decades-long campaign. Now, China says the Afghan lawyer Jirga's decision to release Taliban prisoners will create favorable conditions for the intra-Afghan dialogue in the country. At a news briefing in Beijing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian welcomed the step as an enabling measure. Zhao said the release of prisoners will help establish mutual trust between Kabul and the Taliban. Earlier, Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani signed the decree to free the remaining 400 Taliban under the Doha peace deal after the lawyer Jirga passed their release. Moving on, Lebanese President Michel Aoun has accepted the government's resignation over last week's massive explosion in Beirut. But Aoun has asked the government to stay as caretaker until a new cabinet is formed. Yesterday, Prime Minister Hassan Diab resigned, saying the explosion was a result of endemic corruption. More details in this report.
The devastating Beirut blast has landed a politically volatile Lebanon in turmoil once again. Following 3 ministers' resignations, Prime Minister Hassan Diab stepped down along with his entire cabinet. Diab said his government has done everything to save the country, but corrupt elements are trying to score political points. He said his cabinet followed the will of the people to hold those responsible accountable for the disaster. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says reformation is the need of the hour for Lebanon.
It is important that a credible and transparent investigation determine the cause of the explosion and bring about the accountability demanded by the Lebanese people. It is also important that reforms be implemented so as to address the needs of the Lebanese people for the longer term.
Lebanon's UN envoy Amal Modalai thanked the world community for extending moral and financial support amid the time of crisis. She said the Lebanese people's demands for accountability after the Beirut explosion are justified.
The pandemic added to the misery of people and compounded their sense of loss and insecurity. Their challenge was a matter of life, of economic hardship, or death by a cruel virus. Then came the explosion. It shattered Beirut and with it what was left of the social and financial security. People are desperate now, angry and afraid. They are demanding and deserve justice, and rightly so.
Lebanon's cabinet's resignation comes amid violent protests over the government's handling of the explosion crisis. Officials estimate that the blast has caused up to $15 billion damage to a country already suffering from a deep financial crisis.
Moving on, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation says Israel's plans to annex Palestinian land is a flagrant violation of international law and human rights. The bloc's human rights body said it calls on the global community to hold Tel Aviv accountable for rights violations. It said Palestinians should be helped to exercise this right of self-determination. Earlier, Jordan said it will look positively on the creation of a binational state that guarantees equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. Israeli annexation can lead to about 4.5% of Palestinians in the West Bank living within enclave territory. Last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his plan to annex parts of the Israeli-occupied West Bank is not off the table yet. He said the matter of annexation resides with the United States. Meanwhile, Israel has decided to close Gaza's main commercial trade route, the Karim Abu Salem crossing. State media said all entries except humanitarian aid and fuel oil will be banned. It said Defense Minister Benny Gantz ordered the closure due to the continued launching of incendiary balloons from Gaza. Palestinian officials say Israeli authorities had been preventing the entry of construction materials to the Palestinian side. Earlier, Israel said 12 fires broke out yesterday due to the launching of the balloons in the 5 residential areas near its border with the Gaza Strip. In a related development, Palestine says Egypt has opened the Rafah crossing with the Gaza Strip for 3 days. In a statement, Palestine's embassy in Cairo said the terminal will remain open in both directions. It said the reopening will allow Palestinian travelers to leave and those stranded to return to Gaza. The crossing was closed in mid-March as part of an effort to stem the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. It was only reopened exceptionally to allow stranded Palestinians to return to the territory. Palestinians returning to seaside enclaves are being quarantined for 21 days as a precautionary measure. French anti-terrorist prosecutors have announced to investigate an attack on a sighting excursion in Niger that left 6 French citizens dead. The deadly rampage was carried out by men on motorcycles armed with rifles who ambushed the group. Most of the French victims were employees of a French humanitarian group, ACTED. 2 Nigerians, including a guide and a driver, were also killed in the attack. The attack took place when the group was out to view local giraffes around the town of Kor. The West African country has seen growing terrorism over the past 3 years. In May, a total of 20 civilians were killed in the region. Now moving to Sudan, where the trial of former President Omar AlBashir has been delayed at the request of his defense lawyer. The court had set the second hearing of the trial for 11th of August. The trial of the ex-president over the military coup opened with a brief hearing in July. Omar AlBashir can face death penalty if convicted over the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi. Bashir stayed in power for 30 years before being overthrown in April last year after several months of street demonstrations. Now, the United States, Germany, United Kingdom and Poland have raised concerns over the recent presidential election in Belarus and the violent protests that followed. This comes after Alexander Lukashenko was declared winner of the presidential election that the opposition described as rigged. Police and protesters clashed for the second consecutive night, in which one demonstrator was killed and thousands were detained. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the vote was not free and fair and condemned the ongoing violence against protesters. Meanwhile, Germany's Foreign Minister Heiko Maas has asked the European Union to reconsider its decision to lift previously imposed sanctions against Belarus. Elsewhere, United Kingdom's Prime Minister spokesman said Britain is raising concerns with Minsk as attempts to suppress protests and unacceptable. Meanwhile, Greece has urged Turkey to cease illegal actions in the eastern Mediterranean. In a statement, the Foreign Ministry said such activity is provocative and undermines peace and security in the region. Greece's Prime Minister has convened the government's National Security Council amid growing tensions with Turkey over drilling in the Mediterranean. The statement said Athens will not accept any blackmail and will defend its sovereign rights. Well, Turkey's Navy issued an advisory saying that its ships will carry out a seismic survey in the eastern Mediterranean over the next 2 weeks. This comes after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that Turkey has resumed energy exploration work in the eastern Mediterranean. He said Greece had not kept its promises regarding such activities in the region. More news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa has said the inter-services intelligence can respond effectively to threats across the spectrum. He said this during his visit to the ISI headquarters in Islamabad. He was given a detailed update on the internal and external security situation of the country. General Bajwa lauded the measures to optimize the intelligence agency's performance. Earlier on arrival, he was received by ISI Director General Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid. Now in India, the death toll from a landslide triggered by heavy rains in the southern Kerala state has risen to 49. Local officials said 12 people have been rescued, but many are still missing. Houses in Kerala's Idukki district were swept away after torrential rain and flooding hit the area. Rescuers said they are using sniffer dogs to help retrieve many of the bodies. A portion of the Petimala Hill caved in, raising the settlement of the tea plantation workers. The India Met Department has issued alerts for heavy rainfall in several districts, including a red alert for Idukki district. United States Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin says Chinese-owned video app TikTok cannot continue in its present form collecting data on Americans. In an interview, he said the Treasury has the tools it needs to remedy the situation. He also said President Donald Trump has made clear that the app is not going to continue in the United States. He declined to comment on Microsoft negotiations to purchase TikTok. Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates has described the company's potential TikTok deal as a poisoned chalice. He made it clear that Microsoft acquiring parts of TikTok won't be easy or simple. Meanwhile, a US media reports that Twitter has had preliminary talks about a potential combination with TikTok. Asia-Pacific markets have risen following gains on Wall Street overnight as investors remain unfazed by the escalating US-China tensions. Japan's Nikkei 225 has advanced almost 2%, while the Topix index jumps nearly 2.5%. South Korea's Kospi has gained over 1.5%, while Australia's benchmark ASX 200 advanced close to 1%. The Hang Seng index in Hong Kong is trading nearly 2.5% higher. Chinese mainland shares also rose, with the Shanghai Composite, the Shenzhen Component and the Shenzhen Composite all edging up fractionally. In the Europa League now, Manchester United beat FC Copenhagen by 1-0 at the Rhine Energy Stadium in Cologne to reach the semi-finals. January signing Bruno Fernandes converted an extra time as the Red Devils had to dig deep to overcome the Danes. Copenhagen dominated the opening half and missed several chances before United spurred into action with Fernandes and Mason hitting the woodwork. Copenhagen's goalkeeper Carl-Johan Johnson was imperious, but United held on to the move to the next round. Elsewhere, Inter Milan also booked a spot in the last four after defeating Bayern Leverkusen by 2-1 at the Merkur Spielarena in Dusseldorf. Nicola Barella and Romelu Lukaku scored 6 minutes apart before reported Chelsea target Kai Havertz pulled a goal back for the Germans. Ukraine's Shakhtar Donetsk will meet Switzerland's FC Basel. Now let's have a look at the weather updates across the world. Well, that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Take care.